The Lepage Center has spent much of this academic year exploring the theme climate change in historical perspective. We have heard from a range of experts on topics such as the evolution of climate history as a methodology, the histories of climate denialism and climate justice, and more recently, the interrelatedness of regional insecurity, climate refugees, and changing urban environments. Throughout this series, the historians, geographers, sociologists, military analysts, and NGO activists featured on these panels affirmed the scientific consensus that climate change is real, is caused by human activity, and is already affecting the planet, especially its most vulnerable populations. Historical perspective shows us that politicians, scientists, and corporate leaders have known about the problem of global warming since at least the 1960s. A recent Washington Post article stressed that during the 1970s, Exxon scientists predicted global warming very accurately, as it turned out. But at the same time, the company began waging a campaign to sow doubts about the scientific consensus that fossil fuels were a principal driver of that warming. Of course, Exxon was not alone in waging these campaigns that increasingly found their way into American classrooms, shaping the curricula of hundreds of thousands of science educators across the country. Katie Worth explored these educational disinformation campaigns in her 2021 book, Miseducation: How Climate Change is Taught in America, which generated widespread praise. Bill McKibben, the noted activist and scholar who was at Villanova on Tuesday for its Sustainability and Poverty Symposium, said, quote, "I thank heaven for the teachers who stand up for the truth, and thank heaven that this book will spark a crucial national conversation about the hijacking of our educational system," unquote. I am delighted that Katie is with us tonight to share her perspective on this important issue, to both close our year-long series on climate change and contribute to a series of Villanova events marking the significance of Earth Day this week and next. Following Katie's presentation, I will pose a few questions and then share with her your questions, which you can pose at any point via the Q&A function. A few words about Katie's distinguished career as a journalist. She spent 6 years writing for WGBH's prestigious Frontline Investigative Journalism series, serving as the lead reporter on a variety of projects. Her awards include the Edward R. Murrow Award for Excellence in Innovation, a National Academy of Science Communication Award, and an Emmy Award for Outstanding New Approaches in the documentary category. Besides her book, Katie's work has appeared in Scientific American, This American Life, National Geographic, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, and the anthology Best American Science and Nature Writing. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you so much for having me. I really am honored to be part of this series, this very cool and important series that y'all are doing. I'm a little frazzled right now, so you'll have to excuse me. I just got back from the dentist and then I couldn't find my phone, but I'm here now and I'm ready. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. This is really not my strong suit. This technology, I'm not that old, but I still feel like an old person. I'm a little bit old though. Okay, so y'all, I think you're seeing my screen, and I'm gonna go ahead and, oops, let me just turn this on, make it into a slideshow. This is my book that I wrote. It's called Miseducation: How Climate Change is Taught in America. I am primarily a writer, and I have played around a lot with various mediums, but I have not really played around with PowerPoint very much. So this is one of the very few PowerPoints I've ever given, and you'll have to forgive me for that as well. I'm definitely not a professional slide deck maker, but I did try to make up for my lack of experience in cool animations. like that one. The story, the origin story of this book for me, one of them, a primary one, was in 2017, a colleague at Frontline and I went to the Marshall Islands. We had funding to do a story about climate change and kids, and we wound up going to the Marshall Islands and making this interactive film called The Last Generation. And I'm just going to go ahead and show you some of it. Let's see here. I think that requires me doing this. And then we'll turn on the sound. Are you all hearing this? Can you hear the sound? Sound is coming through. Great, thanks. Okay, thank you for your patience. We're going to start with Iserman. It's not the start of the film, but it'll give you a good sense of what we made. Okay, here we go.
Modest, small, medium, and large. My name is Iserman. I'm 9 years old, and I live in the Marshall Islands in an island called Nashville. One of the smallest islands I've heard of. It's just like a dot in the earth.
So what you see here is Majuro and the Marshall Islands, and we're zooming in here. And what you need to know about this is the capital of the Marshall Islands. What you need to know is that the entire island has an average of 6 feet above sea level. And the highest point is actually the dump where they've piled things up. And even that is only like 30 feet above sea level. So it's very, very low lying. So we'll continue here.
Sometimes we see like fish. In Marshallese, we call them jipule. When I wake up, I brush my teeth and shower. Sometimes I practice, but most of the time I go and look at my pets. Oh, what was that? What? Crap. On Marshall Islands, you can go outside, you can sleep in. There's not like cities everywhere. It's kind of like you're free. In my opinion, it's the only place that I would never live in if I had to choose.
I'm just going to play you about 1 more minute of this.
Why can I get it?
The North Pole and the South Pole. What do you know about the North Pole and the South Pole? What do we have there? Okay, yes, the ice is melting, and as the ice melts, what happens to the water level? Yes, the water level rises.
I'm learning about like climate change and how it can affect the earth, and also how it can affect the people's lives.
Okay, I think
If
it's
it costs too much, water will bury the island. So that's when people have to move away.
So what we didn't get to there was that his family was considering moving to Oklahoma, where they had some extended family, because for lots of reasons, but one of them was because they were worried about what their kids' future would look like on this island that may not, depending on what happens, may not be habitable for the rest of their life, right? And so they were considering moving to Oklahoma, and that of course begged the question, okay, well, if Iserman moved, so Iserman has been learning about climate change every year in school since he was in kindergarten, and would continue to if he stayed on the island every year, because it's a major social issue there. It's an existential one, right? So the question is, what would he learn about climate change if he moved to Oklahoma? What do kids in Oklahoma learn about climate change? And that was sort of the origin question that I had, because I had just spent 6 weeks on the Marshall Islands and, witnessing like exactly how present the issue is there. And I wanted to know. So I came back and started Googling that, and pretty quickly found out that climate change is often not taught in America, or it's taught not very well. And I wanted to know why. And there hadn't been no one had really like tried to comprehensively answer that question. And I figured my bosses were interested in me like doing some research, some reporting on that. And this question, how is climate change taught in America? And I would love the participants like to, if you are up for it, just like in the chat, maybe tell me how old you are, where you're from, whether or not you learned about climate change in school, in K through 12 education, and if so, when, and like more or less what you learned, like if you felt like you got a good, robust education about it, if you felt like you got mixed messages about it. I'd love to hear that. I'm always asking everyone I ever meet that question. So if you feel like participating in that way, I'd love to hear. Okay, so how is climate change taught in America? Here's a few numbers to think about. So it turns out it's a really tough question to answer because education in this country is so localized. So every day, today, in fact, 3 million teachers were teaching 50 million children in 100,000 public schools. And in this country, we believe in local control, state control and local control. Complicated question, of course, especially right now, political question. But it's hard to tell exactly what's happening behind the closed doors of each, and Zoom screens in some cases, of all of those schools, right? But thanks to some survey work, we do know a few things. The UN did a survey of people across the world and found that a quarter of American kids aged 14 to 17 reject the idea of a climate crisis, right? So that is a lower percentage than their parents' and grandparents' generation, but it's a higher percentage than anywhere else, almost anywhere else on Earth, definitely anywhere else in Europe and North America. So, and that's a lot of kids. And what's striking about that is that 100% of American kids are living in a world that is already defined by the phenomenon, whether or not they accept it or reject it. All right. Unless I hear otherwise from you guys, I'm going to assume all of this is going okay and that you're seeing it and everything is okay. You're hearing me. Okay. So an academic named Eric Plutzer at Penn State, which is just a couple hundred miles from y'all, did a national survey, a couple of national surveys, one in 2015, one in 2019, where he got about 3,000 science teachers from across the country and asked them, he surveyed them and asked how they taught climate change. And what they told him, what they self-reported, was that indicated that like most kids in America are hearing something about climate change in school, but not very much. So most, like more than half, well over half of science teachers said that they spend between 0 and 2 hours a year on climate change. if it's above 0, it's not nothing, that's important, but it's not enough to like kind of fully understand the science of the phenomenon, even though the phenomenon is actually not that complicated, but still it's attached to a lot of other phenomena, and it takes some time to wrap your head around. And the education experts I spoke to said that that's not really probably enough, but regardless, it's something. The trouble is that they're not all teaching accurate stuff about it. Here, I'm seeing chat, so I just want to make sure everything is moving along. Okay, cool. So a third of teachers say they tell their students that many scientists believe that recent climate change is natural. And 2/3 of teachers teach climate change as a debate. So is that true? Do many scientists really believe the climate crisis is natural? Is it a debate? I think probably if you're here, you know the answers to those things. Another cool animation to keep you interested. Most of you have probably heard this statistic that 97% of climate scientists agree that it's human caused. But in fact, that's no longer true. In 2019, this researcher looked at like 11,000 studies that had been published in the first 7 months of 2019, and looked at how they described climate change. And there was exactly 0 of those 11,000 that suggested any natural cause for climate change. So that is to say 100% of climate scientists now say that humans are responsible for the crisis. Okay, so what are the things that that influence climate education? This lady, Jane Hainsey Fry, did this really cool thing. She read my whole book, and then she like distilled my whole book into this one chart. So you don't need to read my book, just like screenshot this and you'll figure it out. And so there's a lot of different things that influence it, right? So it's like the teacher, like, well, who is your teacher? Did your teacher learn about climate change themselves when they were a kid? Do they really understand it themselves? What textbook do you have? What were the influences on the textbooks? Et cetera. Lots and lots of different influences. Not like a single one thing that can define it. But we're going to look at 2 things in this presentation. And the first one is academic standards, which are very exciting. So people's eyes kind of glaze over when I start talking about academic standards. But let me explain to you why you should pay attention, which is that what is an academic standard? It's basically what a kid should know by the end of a given grade. So for example, like in 2nd grade math, a student should learn like how to add 3 numbers, right? And that's in the standards, right? So it just basically says by the end of this grade, kids need to know this stuff. And they're decided by the state. Each state has its own academic standards in each discipline, right? And so it's basically like the most powerful lever of control that a state has over what happens in schools. So it's like this kind of arcane thing. People don't tend to pay much attention to it, but occasionally it gets extremely political. Some of you may recall like Common Core was a standards issue, and that got a lot of people upset. So, and also you're probably hearing about CRT, critical race theory in schools. And so, that also can tell you that that's also like often a standards issue. It's also that gets into other issues too, but like a lot of what the states are doing, what the state houses, what the legislature is doing is messing with academic standards, right? Okay, so this group, the National Center on Science Education, went through every single state and looked at their science standards and looked at what those standards said that kids need to learn about climate change, and then they graded them. Okay, so like here is a map of all of the states. You can see that there's a whole range from A to F. You might notice that there's some partisan, I mean, it's not really surprising, but like the states where the state houses, where the legislatures are controlled and the governorships are controlled by Republicans, which as a party has rejected climate science largely, tend to have less climate change in their schools than blue states. What does Pennsylvania say? You might see that it has an F on this chart. The good news is this chart is about 2 years old, and it has an F because it was it had standards that said not a single word about climate change and dated to 2002. Right. So they hadn't updated. They had some of the oldest science standards in the nation, hadn't updated them. But then last year in 2022, they did update them. And here is what the new standards say. Kids are learning in grades 6 to 8. This number 3 is the one that you want to look at. Ask questions to clarify evidence of the factors that have caused the rise in global temperatures over the past century. This will go into effect in 2025. Okay, so still kids aren't learning about it if the teachers are following the standards exactly in Pennsylvania, but by 2025, they'll in middle school be getting one class about it probably, or maybe 1 week, one lesson, which is better than nothing. Okay, so hold that thought. We're going to come back to standards, but in the meantime, I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit sexier. Back to this chart. We're going to talk about the influence of moneyed interests, okay? And by that, I mean the fossil fuel industry. So there's nothing new about moneyed interests or the fossil fuel industry trying to influence kids. It makes sense, right? So like if you're an industry, lots of industries do this. If you can kind of get kids to have a positive association with your industry, that will pay off for you. You're investing in the future because they'll eventually become adults who have opinions and have money, right? So lots of industries do this. And the Petroleum industry started doing this back in the 40s and 50s after World War II. They realized people had kind of a negative association with the petroleum industry. And so the American Petroleum Institute created this presentation called the Magic Barrel, and they trained 600 workers to go school to school to school to school and give a presentation called the Magic Barrel. And we're going to just watch like 30 seconds of it, but here.
This is the magic barrel of your life, and we've opened it so we can show you some of the modern day miracles that it contains that were made with the help of petrochemicals, which means chemicals from petroleum.
Okay, you can find that on YouTube and watch all 11 minutes of it, but we'll move on. You can probably guess what happens next, all of the magic that you can find in a barrel of oil. So that hundreds of thousands of students saw that. By 1950, they had partnered with DuPont, which is why DuPont was labeled there, but it was actually created by the American Petroleum Institute. But they say that their American Petroleum Institute materials had made their way into 25,000 schools by 1960, is what the statistic is. That's a lot of schools, right? So most American kids had been exposed to this propaganda. Okay, so today they're still doing the same exact thing. And what you're looking at here is a website by the Oklahoma Energy Resource Board, which is a fossil fuel funded agency, and they they do a lot of things, but a huge portion of their work is to create curricula for schools. They will pay for like scholarship. They'll give scholarships. They'll pay for free field trips. They pay teachers to come into these workshops, and like if they do and they get this kind of spend a day with the industry and like getting the industry curricula and propaganda, then they'll get like $400 worth of classroom supplies, and that is a very clear like that is like this is a state that, you know, they went to a 4-day work or school week because they couldn't afford to pay 5 days. And so like you're offering teachers $400 worth of school supplies, and that's powerful. That's powerful in that state and in most places. Okay. So here we'll just take a look at what, like, one of the things that they've created is storybooks. Here is one called Petro Pete's Big Bad Dream. This is Petro Pete. Petro Pete wakes up, Petro Katie wakes up one morning after falling asleep, wondering what life would be like if we didn't have petroleum. He wakes up and he doesn't have his clothes for school. His bike is missing tires. He doesn't have his toothpaste. He has to walk to school. And so he goes to school. He spends the whole day. There's no ice cream. There's no basketballs, etc. And finally, he figures it out. He just is missing all of his petroleum products that day, right? So so he goes home. He turns out it was a big bad dream. He wakes up and he realizes all of his petroleum byproducts are back. And the lesson is that not having petroleum products is a nightmare. So this is a storybook that is in every elementary school in Oklahoma and beyond. Right. And Oklahoma is not the only place where this stuff happens. We did not even a comprehensive, but like some reporting looking at fossil fuel funded education programs aimed at children. And we found all these states had them. You'll notice that Pennsylvania is on there. And I, this afternoon, just went back into my notes to see what it was that we found in Pennsylvania. These are 3 of the petroleum educational, programs funded by fossil fuel industry, companies, lobbyists, et cetera, in Pennsylvania, aimed at Pennsylvania children. So you can explore those if you're curious about it. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about academic standards, and we've talked a little bit about petroleum the industry influence. So let's think about how those two things marry to influence what is taught about climate change, right? So obviously promoting fossil fuels alone does influence climate change, right? But in a more, in kind of an indirect way, but also there's plenty of very direct influence. So a story that I wrote for Scientific American last year looked at Texas, the Texas State Board of Education, and they were considering updating their science standards, just like Pennsylvania was the same year. And what do we care about what's happening in Texas? Who cares about Texas? That's far away. Well, for better or for worse, Texas matters to the rest of us because of textbooks. They're the second largest textbook purchaser in the nation. The state of Texas is, and their the elected Board of Education takes a very, very close look at all the textbooks. And so textbook companies tend to cater what's in the textbooks to what that will fly in Texas. And then it will, and then they, here, let me just, oh my goodness, it's late. I'm already taking up more than my time here. Then that is sold to schools in Pennsylvania, schools all over the country, right? And so that's why we care about Texas. This happened, just an illustration of why this matters. Let's think about evolution. For a long time, that was problematic or not in textbooks. So like, then that goes back to like the 20s when the Texas, Ma Ferguson of Texas was like, screw that. We don't want evolution in our textbooks. We're not teaching that in our schools. And that ultimately meant that evolution was not in textbooks for about the next 40 years anywhere in the country. So that's just to say Texas has always had a big influence on textbooks. Okay, so let's just look at what happened in Texas in 2021. Here are the players involved. There's 6, it's a 15-person board. 6 of them are Democrats, 9 of them are Republicans. Then another player that we're going to be paying attention to is the Texas Energy Council, which is the Texas oil and gas industries, like industry association. And then the people who actually have to learn things, right? So they're fighting over what's going to be in these science standards. And what I'm about to show you is a back and forth over one line change where it had been proposed by the educators who had drafted the new science standards. The teachers drafted these new science standards. They went before the board, right? And now they're looking line by line through these standards and like approving them, crossing them out. And like what had been in those proposed standards was describe efforts to mitigate climate change, including reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. That was going to be in the science standards. A Republican proposed crossing that out, saying it was not age appropriate for middle schoolers, et cetera. This is the exchange that went down. These are 2 members of the Board of Education.
We absolutely cannot let oil and gas industry dictate what our kids need to learn when it comes to science. It shouldn't be about the Texas Energy Council. It should be about what's best for our students. So we've had all of these teacher groups come and tell us what's best, but now we're taking out things because oil and gas doesn't want our students to know. Let's be clear about what's going on. So we've already voted to take out greenhouse gases, as we already talked about earlier in the week. Now we want to talk about taking out ways to mitigate greenhouse gases. So let's call it what it is. It's not about what our science teachers are suggesting or what the science industry is suggesting. At this point, we're only making votes based on what oil and gas wants us to do.
Just a few thoughts and reactions. One is, I think our permanent school fund is generally funded by oil and gas. And all of us are probably going to get home using oil and gas. But that aside, what's missing for me here, and Shelley, I think it's a verb, it's a describe. What I'm looking for is the critical thinking discussion. So if all of this is true, greenhouse gases are evil, what do we do? Do we ban gasoline and stop using gasoline cars? Do we ban diesel for trucks? How do we get our Amazon and Walmart purchases? Do we ban HFO for ships? How does the product?
Okay, I'm going to just stop there because we're short on time. I missed a key point, which is that that line was crossed out at the behest of the Texas Energy Council. They came up and testified and said that it, among other things, needed to be deleted from the standards because they really care about education. They're very invested in Texas education. And this was the debate that happened after they suggested that. Okay. So who are these 2 people? You may have guessed.
We absolutely cannot let.
So here's Aisha Davis. She's one of the Democrats. She used to be a science teacher herself. She now has a PhD in education, et cetera. She was elected to represent Dallas. And then Will Hickman was the second person you saw. What is his day job? It's he's an in-house counsel for Exxon. And he's been elected to the board. And you heard him argue, like, why would we bring this up? What are we going to do? Ban fossil fuels? Like, his perspective was we shouldn't include any criticism of the fossil fuel industry to these students. And he would go on to argue that it wasn't age appropriate, that they should only learn about it maybe in college and not in public school, et cetera. And I am sorry to report that the Republicans most of the Republicans voted to exit, and that line is not in the standards today. So that just kind of gives you an example of how this fossil fuel industry is influencing in this direct way, where they're creating curricula, dispersing, sending it out, and it's being used in classrooms. And then also in this top-down way, where they're actually showing up to these board hearings that are totally obscure, and like most people aren't attending them, but the Texas oil industry is, and is getting its point of view in front of school children in Texas and therefore across the country. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up here with a different note, which is like part of my book looked at, okay, well, like if we are going to teach climate, what does a good climate education consist of? If we are going to be teaching it to students, what do we need students to know, right? It's very simple. 8 words. It's real. It's us. We're causing it. It's bad. And there's hope that there actually is. There are actions that we can take, that we have already taken, in fact, that have already begun to mitigate the issue and can continue to do so. We don't want to be talking to students and giving them the false impression that there's nothing to be done about it. And the only thing to do is to be hopeless and hedonistic. And also we don't want to give them the impression that they alone are responsible for fixing it, but like that collective action is the most likely thing to actually create the change that we need to forestall the worst impacts of the climate crisis. Okay, so where do I find some hope? We've got intrepid teachers all over the country. In every school district, and probably in every school in America, there's some teacher who knows about this issue, cares about this issue, and is teaching it. We certainly know that students care about this issue, and they are making their voices known. And then they're also they and other people who care about education are influencing things like academic standards, among other things. They're putting climate education into maybe it's not in your school, but it's probably in your local science museum. You can learn about it in your library. There's lots of informal education. It's on the internet. There's lots of ways to intersect with information about it. And so there's a lot of really good work happening in this space. And I can go into some detail if people are interested in what that's looking like. But yeah, there's plenty of hope. I guess I'll just leave it there. So we've made it to the end of the slide deck, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Great. Well, thank you, Katie, for a really interesting and important presentation. I'll first note that I think your PowerPoint skills are better than you give yourself credit for. You had some cool animations there. So your book is very comprehensive. You talk about going to conferences. You talked about going to school board meetings. There was one scene in the book that I just wanted you to reflect on, which is a conference. I think it was organized by the Heartland Institute in Washington, D.C., and you had this encounter with Joe Bast, who's the president of the Heartland Institute. Just seemed like, I don't know what kind of a moment it was for you as a journalist to have this, the head of the Heartland Institute, which from my perspective is one of the most active purveyors of misinformation. So do you want to reflect on what you learned from that conference and just from the industry perspective about how they saw themselves having to wage maybe a counteroffensive given some of the progress under the Obama administration?
Yeah, absolutely. So immediately after going to the Marshall Islands, I came back and I had started to look into the Heartland Institute. So for those who don't know, the Heartland Institute has kind of become the they're sort of like the coordinator of the climate denial world at this point. They're a nonprofit. They're based in Chicago. They're not even a very big nonprofit, but every year they put on these conferences that are called the Non-Intergovernmental Conference on Climate Change. So they're like basically trying to offer an alternative to the UN, and they gather all of the climate deniers in the country, some actually internationally. They show up to these conferences and present their so-called research, almost none of which is peer-reviewed. All of which that I've reviewed is suspicious and ideologically driven. And some of it says like climate change isn't happening at all. It's all a myth. Some of it says, oh, well, it is happening, but it's not human caused. Some of it's saying, well, it's happening, it's human caused, but it's not actually that bad. Like it's actually good because if you have more CO2, you're feeding plants more, like it's going to be good for the planet. Some of it says, some of them say like, okay, well, it's happening and it's human cause and it's probably going to have some bad effects, but like there's nothing to do about it anyway. So let's just keep going. So like they come at it from all these different approaches, right? And so I was interested in them and I showed up there and I had this question about climate education. And I kind of started talking to Joe Bast, who was running Heartland at the time. And I was like, what do you think about the fact that so many teachers, like how teachers teach it? Like so many teachers don't teach climate, they teach climate denialism, which is presumably what he prefers. And he's like, oh, that's great. It's because teachers are just so smart, much smarter than journalists are. And he says, and in fact, we have just started sending out a book to every science teacher in America about how climate change is a hoax and how to teach it to their information on how to teach it to their students, in a denialist way, and quote what he would call an accurate way, but that is not accurate. And so that had not been reported before, but in fact, it was true. We found out that they had sent out, begun to send out tens of thousands of these books, these packets to teachers, and they had bought lists of names of science teachers and mailed them. Most science teachers in America did receive one. And, as I was reporting this, I spoke to hundreds of science teachers, almost all of whom had received one. So, most teachers had thrown it away right away. Like they just looked at it and thought I don't need this or whatever. Or this seems suspicious. They threw it away. But I did talk to some teachers who said, oh, yeah, like my colleague has been showing that DVD every year in his classroom. So it is, some students are being, unfortunately, exposed to this misinformation campaign.
I think it was called Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming.
Yeah.
That whole idea of disagreement and debate and discussion and so on and so forth is a very effective wedge into the conversation. And I want to encourage the audience members to pose questions in the Q&A as well. But how have national teacher organizations, NEA or others, how have they responded to this the problem of disinformation? How have they engaged the national scope of the question?
Yeah, so almost immediately after that, the National Science Teachers Association, the NSTA, they reported that they immediately stood up and sent an email to all of their members and said, like, you may receive this junk, and it's junk, and like, don't take it seriously because it's a misinformation campaign. And if you're interested in teaching climate change robustly with accuracy, like, we have resources for that. And what's interesting, though, is it's a very large and old organization that for many years has had partners in the fossil fuel industry. And in fact, like back in the late 90s and early 2000s, was producing some climate skeptical materials themselves and distributing it to science teachers, not exactly climate denialism in quite the same like extreme way, but in, like, scientists don't really know what's happening. Who's to say? It's like this kind of this kind of material that was a little bit shady, right? But as we've continued, it's like, I think about it like cigarettes. Like, there was a time when there was a quote debate over whether cigarettes cause cancer, or whether secondhand smoke causes cancer. And like today, you would never hear that debate, right? Like, nobody is questioning whether it causes cancer.
It took 30 or 40 years for that to gain traction.
It did. But there was this moment where it just became so obviously true to everyone that they gave up. The tobacco industry stopped, fighting it, right? And now you'd get laughed at if you argued whether cigarettes cause cancer, right? So like, there's going to be that moment when it's just so overwhelmingly obvious what's happening that there's no longer, like, denial is no longer going to be an option, but the industry really wants to postpone and prolong. They just want to continue. The longer that they can postpone action on climate change, the more extraction they can do and the more money they can make. And that's their obligation. They're trying to make as much money for their shareholders as possible, right? So it's certainly sensible from a certain point of view. But yeah, it's like when you're talking about this National Science Teachers Association, I think in 2002, 2005, there was still that kind of plausible deniability to it, which there just isn't anymore. And so when there was this very, very clear attempt at disinformation, they stood up and really took a stand on it.
Let me shift to some of our audience questions. The first one would be just to think about, you've been talking mostly about public schools. Do you see a difference in private schools? Is there a different curricula? Is there a different process of selecting educational materials?
Yeah, I did do some reporting in private schools. It turned out to be pretty. It's a big project, and I hope somebody does it. But it's like private schools are not, in most states, are not obligated to follow the standards, and they can use any textbooks they want. And so you kind of you would have to do a survey of private schools to really figure out what's happening there. And I'm sure there's a huge variety of these things. And there's also, what we do know is there's a lot of textbooks that are being tailor-made for kind of homeschool or religious schools that have really explicit climate denial in them. But also there's really good materials out there that are also being used. So it sort of depends on who's running the private school, what their orientation is. But one thing that's super interesting is that Amy Westervelt did some investigative reporting, or did a story about Catholic schools. And because the the Pope has embraced the climate crisis as being real and important. The schools, the Catholic schools in America are altering their curriculum, and it may be that pretty soon students in Catholic schools are getting a much better education about climate change than students in like public schools right down the street.
Laudato Si has had quite an impact on Catholics' understanding of the climate change crisis, I think.
Absolutely.
Speaking on that theme, we have a question from a historian of Christianity who was thinking about how capitalism is built on consuming the earth, fossil fuels, extraction, and so forth. The question, modern progressive Christians are trying to rewrite this narrative, but it seems like this foundational assumption about the end of the world is a huge barrier lurking under the surface. Do you see this changing?
So I am so fascinated by that question, and I have asked it myself. I think, like, I just don't know. I'm not a theology or I'm not somebody that has studied religion very much. And so I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask about it. But there are certainly people working really hard. Actually, there's a chapter in my book that looks at the intersection of evolution, the anti-evolution and the anti-climate change education movements. And what I learned was that within evangelical Christian world, there was a very explicit and heated debate among the people that were in charge, not among the lay people, about what to do about climate change, because, lots of Christians are very concerned about the environment, and there's nothing in Christianity that necessarily would lend Christians to be skeptical of climate change, right? But a lot of them politically have been, and I say them because I'm not Christian, and I honestly don't know very much. I'm not that familiar with it, so excuse me if I say some ignorant stuff here. But what I learned in my reporting was that there was kind of a deal made between the fossil fuel industry and the leaders of the conservative evangelical churches that said, like, hey, we're under the same big tent. We've supported the fossil fuel, the kind of libertarian, anti-government fossil fuel interests have supported conservative Christian causes like abortion. And we want you now to support our cause, which is small government. And in this particular case, the skepticism of climate change, and that was actually like a very real and very prolonged debate in the evangelical churches. And there's a great book about it that I'm forgetting the name of right this minute, but I'll come up with it in a minute, I'm sure. And if you're interested more in how that happened in the evangelical world, that would be a really good place to start.
You mentioned that this is something you investigated in an article.
Yeah, it's in my book. It's a chapter in my book about the kind of. I started by looking at the history of the anti-evolution movement in schools, because for a long time that was the big scientific, quote, controversy in education is, should evolution be taught in schools, right? And that was, for most of the 20th century, that was the big debate in science education. And so I looked at that debate, the history of that debate, to kind of get a sense of, like, how did that play out? And I soon found that there was this conjunction between the two movements, the anti-evolution folks who are still working on their issue, and the anti-climate education folks, and that they had married their issues. And now there are bills that are being proposed all over the country every single year that would provide protections to teachers, science teachers, who want to introduce like alternatives to the mainstream theories of evolution and climate change, right? So if you go into class and your teacher teaches you that like evolution is, or, you know, that there's, you know, some other theory other than evolution that's valid, they're protected in these states where these bills have passed. And in those same bills, they're protecting people who provide alternative theories about climate change.
Yeah, chapter 3 in Miseducation, which is in the Lepage Center reading room, by the way. We have one final question from a historian type who writes that the Magic Barrel campaign was an interesting historical example of moneyed interests and their ability to engage with and influence children directly. Did you come across any historical examples of resistance to this influence of moneyed interest for climate change or other intervention into education? And if so, can this inform how we address the issue in the present?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there have always been people skeptical of private interests in classrooms and kind of who prefer this idea of classrooms and education as sort of a more protected space where we're just like the ideal is like we're just giving children education and information that will help them navigate the world, and like the influence of these you know, like private moneyed interests is you know, watering down their education and like hurting it, you know, hurting children because they don't have the skills yet to see through that, right? And it's like I write in the book that at one point I was sitting in a classroom in Arkansas and in walked an employee of the Arkansas Oil and Gas Association, and she was there to talk to the 7th graders, and she had a PowerPoint that was much better than mine, where she talked about you know, like some of it was really legit information, like where in Arkansas can you find oil? What are the machines that pull it up? What are the potential jobs in the industry? But then she got into like, you know, you might hear some people saying that oil and gas is a problem because it creates carbon, but every single source of energy is problematic. Like windmills kill birds and solar panels use these like, you know, rare earth minerals, and they're terrible. And so like any source of energy is going to cause problems. And then she moved on, right? And so what's the problem with that? Which is like the students didn't ask a single question. Their questions were, how much money could I make on an oil rig, right? Like, which is what 7th graders are concerned about, right? But the teacher didn't question it, and the students didn't question it. And so now they have this idea in their head. Next time they do hear like, oh, well, carbon dioxide is probably like global warming is a problem, they're going to be like, yeah, every source of, you know, windmills kill birds. So like, who's to say what's right, you know? And so like, it's this inoculation against future actual education. You know what I mean? So it's like, I think I'm like not answering this question very directly, but there is a very good book from this early 70s called Hucksters in the Classroom that outlined Magic Barrel and many other efforts, not just by the fossil fuel industry, but like by cereal companies and, you know, all kinds of industries that had an interest in like planting in children a positive association with their industry or their product. Home ec classes would get free cookbooks from root beer, you know, from Pabst root beer, and then like how you can use Pabst root beer in a recipe, and then like, you know, there's an obvious reason for that, and there was as this book lays out, Hucksters in the Classroom, there was resistance to that.
That's a great example. We'll have to look up that. By the way, you were referencing a book about evangelicals, and one of our members mentioned that it could be a climate for change. Catherine Hayhoe and Andrew Farr.
Great, but that's not the book I'm particularly thinking of. This is a book that's about exactly about like it's like an investigative story about how the evangelical church approached the issue and like debated the issue of climate change. And
You can send it to me, post it on the Lepage Center website.
yeah, great. Thanks.
It sounds interesting.
It's called The Gospel of Climate Skepticism, Why Evangelical Christians Oppose Action on Climate Change. It's by Robin Globus Veldman. And she's a very good writer, and it's kind of devastating to read to realize actually they were pretty close to embracing climate change. And as like a theological issue, as an issue that they thought that the church was obliged to take seriously. And then things changed, and they've instead chosen to reject it, and many of those churches have. So it's a good book.
The Gospel of Climate Skepticism.
Yeah.
Great. So I think we're running out of time. Katie, do you have any final thoughts about your research, maybe what you are doing recently and how it might project out of your miseducation work?
Yeah, I am hoping to move on from climate education pretty soon, but I have been doing some more reporting on what's happening in Texas. I live in Texas now, and so that's continuing to be interesting to me. And I also I'm from Northern California, where from the town right next to Paradise, which burned down in the 2018 Camp Fire. And I did a story for This American Life about kids in that town learning about climate change after their town burned down, and kind of how they kind of have grappled with that. And so those are kind of the most recent things I've done on climate education. And I'm, I have a few more things in my mind, but also my attention span for climate education is almost through. So you might see me covering some other things.
Good. Well, we look forward to seeing your work in print, and I can't thank you enough for joining us to close our series on climate change, especially after your long journey. So I want to thank the audience for joining us on this beautiful Thursday evening. Go out and enjoy the weather before the weekend. And I look forward to seeing all of you back on the Zoom and in person in the fall.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.